Welcome to Theme 6. We're going to start talking about the approach, how you approach people in a sales context, and how you present both yourself, your products, your brand, and your company to them within the sales function. Before you deliver a presentation, you should develop a presentation strategy. A presentation strategy is a well-conceived plan that includes these three things. You want to understand very clearly what the objective of your presentation is. What are you trying to achieve through this presentation? Then you want to develop a plan to help you reach those objectives, the plan for your presentation that will help you meet the specific objectives you set for your presentation. And through all this, you want to be reminding yourself of your commitment to providing excellent and outstanding customer service. The presentation isn't a chance for you to show off. It's not a chance for you to check off some objectives from your own personal to-do list. A good presentation strategy is all about providing that value to your customers and helping them achieve value or derive value through your presentation and ultimately, hopefully, what comes after the presentation. Achieving these achieving these results will require very careful needs analysis. What does your customer need, and how can your presentation strategy help them in achieving those needs or realizing those needs or satisfying those needs? What specific products or services do you think might help your customer meet those needs or satisfy those needs? And how can you focus on those? There's no point in delivering a presentation to a customer for products and services that are actually irrelevant to their unique needs and situation. Your presentation needs to be crystal clear, very easy to follow, and follow basic presentation protocol, which we'll go over later. If at all possible, you want to have informative demonstrations, and so take the presentation off of, and of course in this context we're talking about formal sort of PowerPoint presentations, but what can you do beyond the PowerPoint slideshow to help the information come alive? And very often that comes in the form of handouts or physical objects or demonstrations where the people who are your audience for your presentation can actually engage in a meaningful way with what it is you're trying to convey. You of course want to take a win-win approach to the presentation and always commit to flawless service after the sale. And so you want to convey that commitment to your audience during your presentation. Good presentation strategies add value to your customers. This value is added when you demonstrate to your customers that you are a resource to them. You're there to help them resolve whatever issues or challenges they happen to have. You're not just someone there to sell something to them. You are a resource. You are valuable to them. Your presentation plan needs to be created to carefully meet your objectives for your sales call. Of course, you have to meet your own objectives, but it needs to be customized and adapted to meet the unique needs and time constraints and situations for your audiences. One thing that some salespeople do, and you need to be really careful about doing this, is what's called the canned presentation, which means there's a standard presentation that the salesperson delivers to all customers regardless of circumstance and regardless of unique considerations. And that may work, but often it can backfire, especially if the audience or the people you're presenting to can detect that this presentation isn't actually meant for them. It's just your canned approach to all salespeople, and they're really no different than anybody else. And so you need to be really careful, and you want to customize your presentation strategy for each individual customer and in accordance to their needs. The pre-approach are all those activities that you partake in that precede the actual interaction or the actual sales call and set the stage for a personalized sales approach tailored to the specific needs of your prospective client. These include two main objectives. The first one is to prepare your pre-sale objective. So what are you trying to achieve in the when you first approach the prospective client, and develop, of course, your pre-sale presentation plan. The approach is the very first time you contact the prospect, either face-to-face or by telephone. And there's three primary objectives to that very first interaction. The first is to build a bit of rapport with the prospect. You don't want to go in and lead with your sales pitch because that will turn people off. You want to find a way to build rapport, find ways to make meaningful connections and demonstrate that you are genuinely interested in your client and who they are and what their needs are. You want to capture the person's full attention. You don't want to catch them when they're busy doing something else or engaged, their mind is engaged elsewhere. You want their full attention, and you want to generate interest in the product that you're selling. So those are some of the objectives in the pre-approach and the approach the first time you connect with the prospective customer. Let's take a minute and talk about team presentation strategies. And this is something that many of you would have lots of experience in because a lot of the presentations that we do in the business program are team or group-based presentations. And as a faculty member who has probably seen hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of student presentations, it becomes very clear how many or which groups have actually taken some time, at least a few minutes, if not longer, to develop a team presentation strategy versus those groups who quite literally just say, you do the first 3 slides, I'll do the next 3 slides, and just divide it up sort of arbitrarily without ever talking about the strategy the team is going to use to make their presentation. Team presentations can increase the complexity of the presentation situation, and it's really important in professional settings to have a team presentation strategy. These strategies help provide more information about the precise needs of your clients. It helps improve the selection of the product. It's more informative. The presentations end up being more informative, and the shorter selling cycle, meaning the quicker you get to the transaction, which is often ultimately one of your goals. Each team member during a presentation should have a clear understanding of what role they're going to play in the presentation. You want to share with all members of the team as much information about the customer as possible and understand the basics of consultative selling presentations, and ultimately each group member should provide value. It's not easy to do, and salespeople who do it well, the presentation comes off as very, very professional. Some of the things that I've observed students do in the team presentations throughout my teaching at UPEI, very clearly students have often not contacted or had any communication with each other. It's often very obvious when students in groups simply just cut and paste slides together because the formatting and the context and the style of the slides often are different and all over the map and don't really flow together cohesively. One of the ways you can really tell whether a team has put together a team presentation strategy is in how the team responds to questions. So if you receive a question from a client or from a professor in the class context, how does the team handle that? I'll tell you, as somebody who asks questions during group presentations, often it's met with stony silence. Students in the group all look down at their shoes, and there's no cohesive plan for how to respond or who's going to respond to the questions. When we work with our case competition teams about delivering presentations, we do encourage them to develop a team presentation strategy, and that really, really comes through in their presentations. It's very clear that they have thought about how they're going to handle any variety of situations, and everyone on the team has a specific and important role and adds value to that presentation. So it's really important for your presentations in your classes, and certainly when you go out into the work world to deliver presentations in the professional context. If you're doing so in a team, even if that team is just 2 people, you do need to take the time to figure out the strategy that you're going to use for a team presentation. So the last slide was about presenting as a committee, but what if you're presenting to a committee? What if your presentation is to be in front of a buying committee, a group of people within an organization who are collectively going to make decisions about whether or not to engage in your products or services? It's much harder to satisfy the needs of a group of people compared to satisfying the needs of an individual, because different people around that table may have different needs within the organization, may have different communication styles, may have different expectations, etc. And so your job as the salesperson is to try to satisfy all of those needs at the same time. And it obviously is a much more difficult situation to be in. You want to be really careful to understand to the best of your ability what role each person plays in influencing the buying decision. Um, and different people around the table will have different roles to play. And so your job is to figure out exactly what are those formal roles, and perhaps even more important, what are those informal roles? Who has the influence around the table that can shape those decisions? You want to make all parties feel involved in the presentation and in the decision making, and so make sure that you're addressing the concerns of each of the individual members of the buying committee. And then you want to find out if there's other people that may be missing. Are there people that aren't around the table that will have a role to play in making the buying decision, and finding out whether or not and how you can engage with them and how you can answer any of their questions or address any of their concerns. This is just a quick 6-step process for your presentation plan. You can just take a look through these various steps. What is the approach? How are you going to approach people? What is the needs, and how can you figure out those needs? Actually delivering the presentation. Negotiation, which is the book that you're reading right now, Getting to Yes, is all about negotiation. How do you go about closing the meeting and ultimately closing the sale? And of course, how do you go about servicing the sale? And so those are the steps of the buying process, and those on the right-hand side are the various steps of the presentation plan and how they adhere or link back to each of the steps of the buying process. Very often the approach will set the tone, at least in the early stages, of any new salesperson and client relationship. And if the approach doesn't go well, it may be the end of the relationship as well. A high quality and professional approach when you first contact a prospective client is a powerful way to add value and to differentiate yourself from the competitors. When done correctly, it will help you earn the right to make a sales presentation. It's really important to establish that credibility early and use the approach to open as many doors as possible with this particular client. There's 3 important objectives. You again want to build rapport, whether your approach is on the phone or whether it's through in-person contact. You want to find a way to make a connection with that customer. So do you have a mutual acquaintance or colleague or friend? Do you have a shared interest in a particular hobby? Is there anything that you can do to build that initial rapport that really isn't about the products or services you're there to sell? It's really more of an interpersonal rapport. You want to capture their attention. Once you move on to starting to talk about the value that your product and service can provide, you want to capture their attention. You want to generate enough interest that they're willing to hear your formal presentation. So this is not the presentation. This is where you're just helping open the door to enable you to actually deliver your full sales pitch. It's really important to establish your credibility early, establish those rapport building type interpersonal relations, because if you don't get past this stage, you'll never get to the point where you're actually delivering a presentation. Often the first time you actually interact with the prospective client, it will be over the telephone. Telephone still represents a really great opportunity to make those connections. Not all first contact needs to be in person. So good, effective use of telephone contacts can be really important. You can use the telephone to inquire about information. You can determine their needs. You can suggest solutions. You can negotiate buyers' concerns, and you can close out the sale. You can actually do all of the sales activities via the telephone if you need to. And there's some real advantages to that, and there's some circumstances where that works quite well. It's very, there's, and we've all experienced it with telemarketers. How scripted do you want to be? You do, of course, want to plan ahead and plan what you're going to say, but in general, it's not a good idea to be so scripted that should something happen and you deviate from that script, or the person you're speaking to asks the question, if you're too scripted, it can throw things off and result in you not looking very polished or prepared. So you do want to plan in advance what you're going to say, but I would really discourage you from being completely scripted, basically reading from a prepared script. I would say the same thing about delivering in-person presentations, and certainly by fourth year, we expect when students go to deliver presentations that they are not scripted. You should not be reading from your notes. You should be comfortable enough with the material. You may need to look down at some key points on your notes, and I have no problem with that in general, but you don't want to be so reliant on those notes that you're basically crippled without them. So you do want to plan in advance what you're going to say, but you don't want it to be scripted. You want to politely identify yourself and the company that you're representing. You want to state the purpose of your phone call and explain how the prospect can benefit from a meeting. So most telephone contact, if it's the first approach, the intention is to have a face-to-face meeting if at all possible. You want to show respect for the prospect's time, especially if the call wasn't scheduled, meaning if you're just calling out of the blue, you don't know what your prospect may be currently doing or how much time they may have available. So you want to be very conscious of the time that you're taking out of their day, and you want to ultimately request an appointment and confirm those details by email, by note or letter or some fashion. So you want to confirm those things as part of your phone call. Let's talk for a minute about the effective use of voicemail or email. You may not be able to reach somebody on the phone, or perhaps you don't have access to a phone number and you need to reach out to a customer for the first time, or a potential customer for the first time using email. When it comes to voicemail, what kind of message will be set when you leave that voicemail? Well, here are some tips. You want to make the message very brief. You don't want it to be too lengthy. People don't listen to the long messages. You want to offer a compelling benefit. You want to hook them in your message so that you will encourage them to call you back, or will encourage their willingness to receive a call from you next time. You want to give them a time to call you back, if at all possible. Suggest a time that you're available anytime between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., Monday through Friday, for example. You want to say your phone number slowly and completely, and actually repeat it more than once so that the person can accurately reach back out to you if they want to. From an email perspective, you want to use a meaningful and specific subject line to catch their attention. You want to tell the reader what you want and then encourage them to respond. So what is the action or call to action that you're asking them to do? You want to identify your main point very early on in the paragraph or in your email. You don't want it to be too lengthy. You want it to be easy to read and formatted well. Of course, Things like correct grammar and spelling are really important. That's something that a lot of young people need to give consideration to. Certainly, when you exchange emails or texts or whatever with your friends, if you want to use informal language, that's fine. But certainly in a professional email, you want to use correct grammar, spelling, punctuation, etc. You want to use a signature file that includes your full name, your title, your affiliation, your phone number, and maybe even a slogan or something. You want to make sure that any information that the prospective customer might need to contact you is easily available in the email. I really liked this quote. I think it's a really good um, summary of the early stages of the sales process. Books are judged by their covers. Houses are appraised by their curb appeal. And people are initially evaluated on how they choose to dress and behave. In a perfect world, this isn't fair, moral, or just. What's inside should always count a great deal more, and eventually it usually does, but not right away. In the meantime, a lot of opportunities can be lost as a result of that poor first impression. So you want to make sure you're making a really good first impression when you meet prospective customers or clients. Building rapport. Um, Building rapport with customers or clients should lead to credibility, which leads to trust. Once trust is established, the prospect is more likely to open up and share really important information with you. Information will provide clues to the ways in which you and your organization can provide value. So building rapport is really important. A lot of the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, is about building rapport with people. 3 areas of conversation that should be considered in developing rapport with customers. You want to comment on here and now observations. You want to offer compliments, but as Dale Carnegie would tell you, you want them to be sincere and genuine. And you want to search for mutual acquaintances or interests that you can sort of start to build that relationship off of. So it could be a mutual professional acquaintance, it could be a mutual personal acquaintance, it could be both of you have an interest in golf or sailing or hockey or baseball or fine wine or whatever. So you want to find those mutual acquaintances or mutual interests and start to build that relationship off of those mutual interests. So how do you arouse interest in a prospective customer? Well, there are 7 common approaches. You can have an agenda, and a lot of people really appreciate when you're going to have a meeting, whether it's a formal presentation or just a meeting with somebody, to have an agenda so that they know what to expect. And if it's presented, if the agenda is provided with people in advance, it gives them an opportunity to reflect on what they may want to say or ask during the meeting. Product demonstrations is a great approach. Anytime you can make an abstract idea like a product or service more real, that is very beneficial. The referral approach. Our mutual friend John, who's been a client of mine for years, suggested I contact you because he thought this product might be a really good fit for your particular business. So anytime you can make those personal connections with in terms of referrals, that's a really good way to arouse people's interests. You can focus on the customer benefit approach and be really emphatic about the benefits that the customers will derive from your products. You can ask questions, and this is really important. Um, Asking questions so you can learn more about the individual and also the organizational needs. You can have a survey approach where it's basically asking questions but in a more formalized way. So having a prospective customer fill out a survey so that you can learn more information about them. Or you can incentivize them by offering them a premium approach. Well, you know what, everyone who sits down with us, we provide them with something to take away, whatever that is, offering them an incentive to meet with you. These are just some of the ways you can in the very beginning, arouse interest from your customers. Sales call reluctance is that fear that a lot of people have of making that first initial contact with the prospect. Once that connection has been made, sales call reluctance actually diminishes substantially. But that first initial contact with the prospect can be a very frightening and intimidating endeavor. This fear is caused by a fear of taking risk, a fear of making presentations, a lack of confidence, or a fear of rejection. And all of these are actually fairly realistic and reasonable fears to have, because sales do end up with, there's a lot of rejection in sales, there's a lot of risk taking in sales. If you're not comfortable presenting in front of a group, you know you're going to have to do that in a sales context. Some of the ways you can deal with that is to be optimistic about the outcome and try to have an optimistic approach. Practice your approach as best as possible before making that initial contact. So being as prepared as humanly possible will help minimize those fears. Recognize that it is normal to feel anxious about meeting people for the first time, and develop a deeper commitment to your goals. Figure out what your goals are and really commit to those, and recognize that making those initial sales calls are part of your ability to achieve those goals. What happens though when the person who you want to connect with and build a relationship with is protected by what's called the gatekeeper? The gatekeeper is an assistant who manages the decision maker's daily schedule. It's really important that you understand who these people are and develop a strategy to help you get past the gatekeeper to ultimately communicate and connect with the person who you're trying to reach. You always want to treat the gatekeeper with respect and with kindness. You want to learn their name, and you want to learn the role that they play in the organization. It's really important. So think of this: if you're a pharmaceutical sales rep and your job is to go around to doctors' offices and tell them about the latest pharmaceutical products that your company has come up with, in order to reach the doctor, before you ever get to talk to the doctor, you're going to have to talk to their receptionist. And so it's really important that you learn their names, you learn what role they play, you treat them with kindness and respect, because if you don't, they can quite literally prevent you from talking to the ultimate person who's going to make the decision about your particular products. So understanding the role and working with the gatekeeper is a really important part of the selling process. The gatekeeper may not be the one who's making the decisions about whether or not to buy your product, but they are the people who stand between you and the person who ultimately will make that decision. Informative presentations are those presentations that emphasize factual information, often taken from technical reports, company-prepared sales literature, or written testimonials from people who have used the product. It's about sharing information. The keys here are to be clear, simple, and direct. You want to present information in a way that is accessible and meaningful to your target audience. And what is accessible and meaningful will depend on who your target audience is. So it's really important, again, during your pre-approach and your approach stages, to learn as much about your audience as possible. So for example, if you're talking to a group of skilled IT people, the way you present technical information may be different than if you're talking to people who aren't as familiar with IT, for example, or the way you would present to a group of scientists is different than the way you would present to a group of non-scientists, for example. This is typically used, informative presentations are typically used for new, highly complex or technical products and services. It's very welcomed, so the communication styles that really welcome informative presentations are those that are reflective or directive. That works really well, and the salesperson must, at the end of the informative presentation, The salesperson must transition from the conveyor of information to the role of trusted business advisor. A salesperson, yes, is an important purveyor of information, but you ultimately want, if it's just information that you're providing and you're not becoming a trusted advisor or value added member or resource of the team, then ultimately people can get information from a number of sources. And so you want to make sure that you're transitioning not just from the purveyor of information, but to that trusted business advisor role. In comparison, persuasive presentations are those sales strategies that are designed to influence your prospective client's beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors and encourage buyer action. Once the need has been identified and clarified, persuasion is used as a communication tool through which you motivate someone to voluntarily do what you want them to do. The transition stage, where the dialogue shifts from being an intellectual endeavor to one that's more based on emotional appeal. It requires a high level of training and experience, and if handled improperly, can actually erode trust and damage relationships. So if people come across as too pushy or too manipulative, that can really damage relationships very quickly. Being persuasive is a very refined skill. And so it's really an important skill that salespeople need to develop. Reminder presentations are those presentations used usually later in the sales process, very often after a sales relationship has been established and transactions have happened. These presentations are used to remind your client of the value that they're deriving from the relationship they have with you and your company and your product. It may be used to offer additional value added. It often happens after the sale in a service context. It often happens where products require care and maintenance. It's often performed by missionary salespeople, so not the original salespeople who generated the original sale, but people who provide that support after sales, and is used with repeat customers, whether it's business to business or business to consumer. It's used for established customers and clientele. We talked earlier about canned presentations. Canned presentations are those presentations that are memorized or scripted. And they're built around a standard set of steps and completely ignore the unique needs of each customer. Each presentation is done in the form of a repetitive speech given to all customers, regardless of their interest in a particular item. If it's done poorly, it can be very discouraging to a customer. They feel very devalued as individuals, and it really reflects this idea of them not being important or relevant to you. It doesn't mean you can't be well rehearsed, but canned presentations can be very dangerous and can actually end up damaging relationships. You want to ultimately adapt your presentation to meet the unique needs of a customer. There can be some general common content, but you want to avoid depersonalizing a presentation. You want to make sure that your presentation is tailored to the unique needs of your customers. You want to cover one idea at a time and use the appropriate amount of detail given who your target audience is. You want to confirm that whoever your audience is understands the point that you're trying to make before moving on, and you want to use the KISS principle, which is basically keep it simple, stupid. Keep it simple. Know who your audience is and speak to them at that level without being condescending or diminishing them in any way, but you want to keep things simple. Use proof devices to demonstrate buyer benefits, so evidence. We talk a lot about evidence in the business program. You want to show them evidence that this product does what it says it's going to do and will ultimately provide the value that the customer ultimately is going to be seeking. This builds confidence in your solution. During your presentation, here are some ways that you can add value. You want to appeal to as many senses as possible. You want to use good visuals in your slides, but also your oral presentations need to be really good as well. You want to speak very clearly and persuasively. If you can also add in tactile or physical components where people can touch and see things for themselves, that is even more impactful. You want to balance telling, showing, and involvement if at all possible. If you can get your audience to get involved in your presentation, that's terrific. If they cannot participate, is there other ways you can get them involved, whether it's handing them out literature or samples or somehow getting them involved in a meaningful way? You want to be creative in your presentations, but not unprofessional. If your presentation is full of razzle dazzle, but not much substance, that won't go very far. Um, so you want to be creative, yes, but you don't want the creativity of your presentation to become more of a distraction than a value add. You can use creativity to gain attention, increase desire, and add value, but be really careful when you do that. You want to consider the use of humor, but in moderation. And of course, there are some topics that should not be discussed at all, and certainly not with humor. You want to be very careful of that. People are increasingly sensitive to inappropriate comments, and so you want to be very careful about that. You want to choose the right setting. Maybe you're going to their physical location, or maybe you're going to a neutral site. So be very mindful of the right setting and focus on the value proposition. So what are the ways in which you're going to provide value, and document those to whatever extent possible. You want to give them as much information and support that information with evidence as possible. Continuing on, you want to quantify the solution. Numbers matter, and anytime you can provide evidence through measurement that something works, that is more impactful than you just offering general platitudes. So quantify things when you can, whether it's the cost benefit analysis, return on investment, etc. Anytime you can measure something that provides value to your customers. You always want to have a backup plan. So let's say you have a PowerPoint slideshow planned. You get there and the projector breaks down. What are you going to do? Well, if you're prepared, you have printed copies of your slideshow ready and available to give to your audience. So you always want to have a backup plan. Technology fails, it fails regularly, and you want to be prepared for that. You want to summarize your main points in the beginning and again at the end of your presentation, and of course ask questions along the way to confirm that your audience is understanding what you're saying. You want to place special emphasis on the relationship that you're building. Reinforce that bond, adapt your communication style for the unique needs of individuals, and again, the more people that are in the room, the harder that is, because there'll be more variation in communication style. You want to use social media where appropriate, but use it professionally. And the saying goes, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. You have to be committed to what it is you're doing. It can't be all about you and selling. It has to be a clear commitment to providing value to the customer. You want to target emotional links and make connections between the salesperson's message and the customer's emotions to increase the chances of closing the sale. So things like that are important to your customer: quality, being on time, service, innovation. What are those things that are important to your customer, and how can you embed those into your presentation and communicate those? And use persuasive vocabulary, talking about advantages, proven, security. What are the buzzwords that are really relevant to your client in their business? And make sure you're using those words. You want to be very specific about the benefits your products and services can provide to your customers. People don't buy things, they buy what the things will do for them. So making sure that you're very specific and confirm your beliefs by asking questions. Showmanship works as long as it doesn't get too distracting. I will never forget one of the best presentations I ever saw was in my intro marketing class early on when I was teaching. It was a third year marketing class. And the group that won the project that year was a group that did not have the best ideas. They weren't the most creative. Their PowerPoint's presentation wasn't the best. But the reason they won that year, and I wasn't the judge, it was a panel of judges from the community, was because they used really good showmanship in their presentation. They were very charismatic. You couldn't take your eyes off them when they presented. They engaged you, and you wanted to hear more from them. And that their showmanship was what ultimately led them to be the winning team from those presentations. Showmanship is an interesting and interactive way of communicating an idea. It really is a way of finding a way to capture people's attention and hold their attention. You want to minimize any negative impact of change. Change is scary for anybody, and so if what you're selling involves change, you want to help mitigate that and minimize the negativity of any potential change, and obviously emphasize the positive. You want to place the strongest appeal at the beginning or at the end of your presentation, or both. So you maybe want to sandwich your presentation with your strongest arguments at the very beginning and conclude with your strongest arguments at the very end. And you want to use the power of association with metaphors and stories and testimonials. Those are really good ways to make your idea more real in the minds of your customers. Some more group sales presentation strategies. Identify all the titles and roles of people who will be in attendance. And if possible, use name cards so that if there's a lot of people in the room, it's easy to remember and recall people's names. I always check out the meeting room in advance. One of the things that I have gotten into the habit of doing is always being the first to arrive. I like to check out the room I'm going to be in and speaking in before the meeting starts. I like to check out my technology, get a feel for the room, how is it set up, what are the various positions people are going to be in the room. Those things really matter, so definitely check out the meeting space in advance. I used to tell students when I taught intro marketing when it was a third year course, and all of our presentations were going to be in the big lecture theater in our building, but that wasn't our classroom. And so I would always encourage them to find a time the room wasn't occupied and actually go and practice giving their presentation in that room, because the room is very large, the sound projects very differently, colors appear on the screen very differently than they would appear on your computer. So again, simulating that and practicing that in the real environment is important. Ensure the presentation is characterized by clarity and simplicity, keeping things very clear, keeping things very simple. And you want to anticipate diverse questions. You want to be prepared for as many different kinds of questions as you can possibly think of, and prepare concise and persuasive answers. You want to make sure that you know how to answer the questions that you can reasonably anticipate. So your audio visuals for your presentations, please don't rely too heavily on what's called the bells and whistles. All the swooping in and swooping out, fading in, fading out, the graphics side of the presentations. Yes, you certainly can use those, but don't rely on them too heavily. I've seen students who do rely a little too heavily on those features in their presentations. I remember when Prezi was first introduced. I remember the first time I saw a presentation that was delivered using Prezi as the application, and I was really impressed the first time I saw it. I had never seen that before. It was the students who delivered the presentation. I thought it looked really great. By the 10th time I've seen it, though, I actually find it to be incredibly distracting and takes away from the actual content. So a little bit of showmanship is good, too much is distracting. Be sure the prospect knows the purpose of the presentation, very clearly state your objectives, Be prepared to stop the presentation to clarify a point or answer a question. I always like to tell people that you can stop me at any time and ask a question. There is a danger in doing that, especially if you're scripted. If your presentation is scripted and somebody interrupts you mid-script, that can cause a real problem for you. So that's why I discourage you from being too scripted. I like when people stop me to ask a question, but as the presenter, I then have the challenge of then getting back on task. You obviously want to answer the question, but don't let the questions completely derail the presentation. You want to review key points at the conclusion and end on a high note, and obviously allow questions at the end, but always end on a high note. Again, make it as real and tangible as possible, including things like showing people the product or taking them on plant tours. You want to show them various models, whether they're working yet or not. You want to show them photos and illustrations and provide them with brochures or literature. You want to give them as much stuff to take away as possible, because that reinforces or enhances the effect of your presentation. Demonstrations are a really effective way, and if it's appropriate, I strongly encourage you to do that. So things like product or plant tours, illustrations, brochures, literature, giving people a copy of your slideshows, portfolios, providing them with binders that have all kinds of information available to them, reprints of third-party materials. If you have a supplier that also is an important sort of cog in the wheel of 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 what products you're providing to your customers, or catalogs, or anything that you can give to people that they can take away, makes your presentation more real and more relevant. So that's the end of this particular week's slideshow, and we'll continue on next week with our next topic.